20 years ago, I was writing my first book, which became known as The Field Guide to Understanding Human Error. And I was writing it in part because I was frustrated, surprised, and angry, frankly, at the way in which investigations were done. The judgmental, counterfactual, hindsight-driven nature in which we do these things, essentially as a mechanism to find a place to park blame. The field guide was all about not doing that, about finding ways and rigorously explaining how to avoid blame and develop better ways to understand why things went wrong and what really human error means. Of course, I'm in perpetual trouble with our dear colleague Eric Holnagel for even using the label human error in titles of books, as he correctly points out that this perpetuates the myth that it actually means something to begin with, rather than simply being an attribution. But this book came out, and in the beginning of that book, I talk about a story that emerged from Los Alamos. I was, and still am, a subscriber to the New York Times, and the New York Times had a little article in there that talked about a couple of hard disks that had gone missing at Los Alamos with some rather sensitive data. Now, of course, Los Alamos is and was part of the University of California system, and it happened to employ at that time, way back 20 years ago, a guy who came across the field guide, was pointed out that this book existed. I think it may have been Ivan Pupoliti to actually show this to him. And he read the book. He understood that this wasn't just talking about Los Alamos, but about a much wider problem of blaming human error for things that went wrong, and found it not only quite insightful, but empowering to start trying to shift the culture at Los Alamos. 20 years later, this one-time informal, fortuitous student of my first book has become a, I was going to say towering, but I suppose it's, you extend in all dimensions, my dear friend. Has become a figure who, well, we can talk about various adjectives, yeah. But a figure who is, I think, become able, unlike any of us, in an unparalleled and uncanny way, to turn the high-flying academic parlance, the ideology, the ivory tower stuff, to take it and turn it into baby food. What I have found is that this is desperately necessary. Of course, the person I'm talking about operates, lives, and works out and in a country that is surprisingly conservative when it comes to corporate culture, when it comes to addressing hierarchy and not deferring to hierarchy, that in fact is a country full of stifled corporate ossified cultures that are anything but innovative, despite the image that they sometimes are able to project, and despite a lot of exceptions to that rule, obviously. In such a culture, it takes somebody like our next speaker to be able to breach the immense cultural wall of silence that envelops many of the initiatives that are necessary to do a safety in a different way. And our next speaker is able to do that because he presents disarmingly. He shows himself as not coming in with the full bore of the scholarship, even though it's in his back pocket, because he's read a lot, but because he is he. I'm speaking, of course, of not only my one-time informal student, I'm not only speaking of the other half of Laurel and Hardy when we are performing together, and the master of feeding babies. I am speaking of Todd Conklin, my dear friend and colleague. Over to you, Todd.
Hey, Sydney, thank you. That was the sweetest and kindest introduction of all. I kind of wondered what you'd say, because we've known each other a really long time, and we have such interesting stories that we can use to blackmail and coerce each other to do crap we don't want to do. For instance, like meetings like this. We could just toss that out as kind of an example. I am tickled pink to hang out with you guys. I'm also tickled pink to be a part of such an august body. And the discussions so far have really been riveting. And I find that challenging and fun. I think I'm going to knock it down a few levels here for you. Just remember as we progress that the camera actually adds 100 pounds. So I'm much thinner than I look. And Sydney's basically a skeleton. So as long as we get that out there, we can kind of work from that direction and move forward. There's a lot of stuff I want to talk about today, but this idea of bouncing forward, and I've sort of captured a couple of things that John said. First of all, let me switch my background. Although donuts is really my favorite thing to think about, I really think we should probably go with the idea that safety is sexy. Um, and the fact that I'm sitting in front of this slide actually fulfills many fantasies for me. So this is a pretty big day as we progress through. I want to start with a little story for you guys because I think the story I want to tell, and it's really recent, it just happened not very long ago. I was working with an organization and we were actually doing some restorative work post some fatalities, which is work we can talk about in great detail. I think it's maybe the more important work we do, and it deserves a lot of attention. But in the midst of it, I had a manager send me an email to describe an event, and the manager was really motivated by this event. And of course, I'm just reading the email, so I'm not nearly as I don't have nearly. Let me use the parlance. I don't have nearly as much skin in the game in this one as you'd think I would, because it's just an email. And he tells a story of a guy who's a fueler, and his job is to fuel these haul trucks, and that's what he does all day long, every day. He fuels haul trucks. And they were in the midst of having a safety stand down post a major event. And we can talk in great detail about how we feel about safety stand downs. I do think it's a really interesting way to get people together to tell them to care more and try harder. But that's not the point of this story either. He was fueling a vehicle and he was in the process of almost being complete. So he almost had the vehicle entirely fueled, and the safety stand down started at 10 a.m. and it was like 10:03 a.m. and he was finishing up, and his supervisor called him and said, "You have to get here. This is mandatory. They're going to take roll. You cannot be late. Get here as soon as possible." And so what the fueler did was finish up, shut the machinery off, jump in a vehicle, and drive to the safety stand down. And in the midst of doing that, everything's fine so far. He didn't take the time to reel the hose back up and did not remove it from the truck. So he basically left the truck connected to the fueling apparatus. With me so far? So am I painting a little picture for you? The meeting, I'm sure, was stunning. I bet it was super interesting and probably involved lots of slides and people telling you to care more and try harder. A classic safety stand down. And then the meeting was over and everybody went back out to work, which is probably what they wanted to do anyway. And so, because it was a large group of people, the driver of the vehicle that was being fueled, the haul truck driver, got out of the meeting before the fueler did, because the fueler unfortunately was late. And so he had to sit in the front of the room, because your punishment for being late to a safety stand down is that you have to sit in the front row, because the guys have filled the back row for probably hours before the meeting started. And so the driver gets to the truck, jumps in the truck, and drives away. And you can imagine the event that happened, a stellar, stunning event, predictive by every metric. He drove off with the fuel hose in the tank of his truck, and he ripped the hose off the fuel pump. Now, it broke away at a breakaway joint that was actually designed in the fuel hose for that very inevitability, and it worked perfectly. That's the event. And the supervisor writes me this really detailed email describing his need to respond to this event. And he explains to me in great detail how the fueler deviated from his standard procedure and, in fact, took a shortcut to go to this meeting and did not reel the hose back in or decouple the vehicle from the fuel pump. And he also told the story of the driver who clearly took a shortcut and did not do a 360-degree walk around. So there was no 360-degree walk around, which would have, of course, heightened his awareness to the fact that there was a fuel hose hooked to his truck. He would have decoupled it and all problems would have been solved. The supervisor's comment to me was that he really thought that both of those people should be punished equally. And the letter he was writing to me, I think, was seeking advice on how much punishment should actually happen. And so I read it carefully and I wrote back and said, how often does this happen? How often do you leave fuel hoses in the vehicle and drive off and the breakaway coupling breaks away as designed? I would be interested in knowing that before we go further on our discussion. And he writes back almost immediately. I mean, he was clearly just sitting there waiting for me to respond. And he said, that is the second time it's happened in 7 years. And so I wrote back and said, I'm not sure this is an event. I actually think this could be an excellent example of your systems performing exactly the way you've designed them to. And when testing the brittleness of this system, your choice to either blame and punish or learn and improve is just that. It's a choice. And as a leader, that deliberate strategy that you're going to move forward and sort of lay over the entire organization is really going to color what happens. And he wrote back and he said, well, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. And I said, well, what did you want from this? What's the desired outcome? Because that would help me. And that part of the discussion got really interesting because that part of the discussion allowed us to have really a quite interesting and I thought wonderful talk about this idea of how leadership reacts. And I want to take you down that journey as we talk about what John Green so cleverly called, not as clever as safety is sexy, the great COVID reset. I don't know jack squat about COVID. I'm not going to talk about COVID, but I want to talk about this idea of the deliberate path forward. Because we're in a discussion today, pretty much all day long, where we're talking about safety innovation. And I think first and foremost, as we talk about safety innovation, I would take you to a model that's not in the safety science side of the house, but in fact comes from a man named Ev Rogers, a book that if you've not seen or read, you should, called Diffusion of Innovation. And he talks about the innovation model, a curve. It's kind of a bell curve that's been sort of squished down. And he talks about the idea that there are innovators, the people on sort of the cutting edge, the people that are out there on the very sharpest point, actually making tracks and breaking eggs and changing ideas. And then behind them are the early adopters. And then behind them are the early majority. And if I remember this correctly, I'm going on memory. Behind them, I think, are the late majority. And then the tail of that curve are the laggards. And that's how innovation moves as it carefully moves. And Rogers studied the innovation of hybrid seed corn in the Midwestern part of the United States. And he looked at people who actually were farming, who were growing corn as a part of their agricultural crop. And he looked at what type of people actually make new ideas happen. And I think a big part foundationally of what we want to talk about is what do we as a profession think about the fact that once we were identified as these innovators, these people on the edge, but now the curve is sort of catching up with us. And what's amazing about the discussion we had around the fueler and the hose being left is that it didn't take nearly as long or nearly as much effort to actually get that leader to understand that ultimately the goal is to default towards this idea of improvement, of getting better. And I think that really bears some important discussion for all of us as we think about the direction that safety is moving. because it's been a really interesting 15 months or so. You were there, so you know exactly what it was like. But you watched the world move from really organizations that were really set up to optimize efficiency to beginning discussions around this idea of optimizing towards resilience or capacity. And what's happened is that the idea that we operate in this complex environment is becoming more mainstreamed. And I think it's been amplified greatly by the fact that we've gone through this change, this crisis. And what I think is most valuable for us to think about, and this is kind of what I've been doing a bunch this year, it's been a really interesting year for me, is the ability to sort of think about the great COVID reset, as John said. I actually think we have an opportunity to really not think of this as a reset. But if we use some of the knowledge and theory that comes out of diffusion study, what we know is that, in fact, this great period of uncertainty has probably amplified some of these early adopting ideas so that they're more part of a dialogue of at least that middle part of the bell curve, the early majority. And I would even suggest, to some extent, the late majority. Because to have a discussion with a supervisor who's really interested in punishing both a fueler and a driver, but to end that discussion actually talking about organizational improvement and learning from typical work and understanding how to really look at and value the ability to learn is a pretty important indicator for us. I mean, I actually think, and you guys jump in and tell me if I'm wrong, because I'm wrong on a ton of crap. I mean, just listen to me, you'll hear it. I actually think we're in a position where the ideas we've talked about before that were somewhat novel theories for organizations to try and really improve are now becoming much more mainstream ideas as the idea of optimizing systems towards having additional capacity is becoming apparent. And that's been a really important part of what I've thought about this year. And my guess is you have as well, because there's a couple things we should just sort of stipulate as a part of our discussion, because we're talking about innovation. We're talking sort of about the edge. We're moving forward in the way we think, and we're challenging one another. And one of the things I'm going to tell you is that the senior leadership of your organization was really freaked out this year. I mean, really freaked out. And they were freaked out because they were met with this dramatic uncertainty. And this dramatic uncertainty really forced them into a position where they almost had to think about the world in a way that has been traditionally different. They had to move from this idea of optimizing systems so they're efficient, better, faster, cheaper, shareholder value. These are all words that companies use around the globe, to systems that really talked about the notion of additional capacity, of resilience, of hedging bets, of storing up both resources, time, energy, people, places, processes in order to become recoverable. And that idea, I think, is incredibly valuable to what we talk about. And it's really hinged around this notion that as dramatic and as sexy, because John's made that word okay to use, so I'm going to use it as much as I can, as sexy as it is to believe that if we could predict the future, we could control the future, which is relatively the story of every single person who's ever said the word leading safety metrics in a conversation around a boardroom table anywhere in the world. All that is sort of this fantasy idea that if we can predict the future, we can control the future. But here's what we know, and it was amplified dramatically in the last 16 months. The future's uncertain. And I think there's good news in this statement. And the good news I'd share with you is that the future's always been uncertain. This isn't new. This isn't even terribly shocking. It's that we've moved on this diffusion of innovation model so that more people are now interested in the things we've been thinking about for a long time. And I guess that's exciting. I mean, it's to me personally a tiny bit frightening because it was way more fun to be a disruptor. It was way more fun to go to meetings and tell people their baby was ugly because it sort of gave you this nice status that you could move forward with, but it's kind of gone away. And so we know some things as we move into this discussion that are pretty important to us. One is it's really kind of stupid to try to predict the future in order to control the future. We have to accept the fact that we don't know. And you've heard it a bunch already today. In fact, Sydney was brilliant. You heard me say that right, Sydney. Brilliant. You were brilliant in the fact that you talked directly about the idea that we simply have to be curious. We have to think. We have to look forward. We have to ask questions. We have to think about things in ways that we have not thought about them before. And we simply don't know what will happen. So whether we want to take any of the names that have been tossed around, which I'm having a hard time sort of determining what these different names mean, they strike me all as sort of distinctions without differences. But as we move forward to look at the world differently, what's happening is that our organizations are having to look differently at the strategies they use to actually move ahead. And the strategy is moving really across the board to one that's really one more, it's a strategy more of capacity than it is a strategy of probability. And I think that's been very interesting. I mean, I think that introduction is stunning in the opportunity it's giving us to actually take the ideas that we've played with on the periphery of our organizations and actually move them directly into the mainstream. I'll just cut to the chase. Where once I would spend a lot of time describing what I meant when I said the presence of capacity in a system, I don't have to spend that time anymore. Because if you tried to buy toilet paper in the last 9 months, you understand the notion of capacity, right? Because to a great extent, we were wiped out on the toilet paper front, which is a joke that I will never, ever tire of. I promise you, years from now, I won't tire from that of that. So that put us in a position where we got the ability to look around. And was looking deeply for things that I think resonated. And I was looking for some academic work that would help us understand how to move forward mid crisis into uncertainty. And how do we help organizations actually bounce forward as opposed to resetting or even going back to normal? How can we take the advantages that have happened by dramatic bureaucratic reduction, dramatic decluttering of systems? I mean, lots of things went away very quickly. How can we bounce forward so that we don't have to walk backwards? Because it strikes me that we're stupid if we don't come out of this better. I mean, that's the challenge I would give you. And I was lucky because I got to spend a tremendous amount of time with leaders all across the globe. Because once you give a little presentation on bouncing forward from uncertainty, other organizations talk to each other and everybody thinks they need to hear it, even though it's the same crap every time. It was lucky. And I initially found a theory that actually comes from previous studies that if you're not familiar with it, it's really worthwhile to look at. And it's the concept of VUCA. And I don't know if you're familiar with this VUCA, but it's an acronym that stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And to a great extent, those are the things we've talked about for years. In fact, those are the things that workers adaptively manage all the time. Volatility, this idea that the world's constantly in change, uncertainty, the tools you normally use to make decisions no longer really function very well because the context of the world has changed around you. Complexity, I would have David Provan define that for us, but that might actually take us into a weird direction. Many pieces tightly coupled, right? And then my favorite, ambiguity. And what's interesting is that the idea of ambiguity is that I've never been here before. And because I've never been here before, where that puts me is in a position where I've got to sort of either mold my future actions based upon past experience or boldly, in the spirit of micro experimentation, move forward. And that's been a big part of what happens. And VUCA teaches us, if you look at the theory, basically four very key organizational coping mechanisms that I think have become incredibly invaluable to us and we should talk about. Because if we don't sort of figure these out and speak to these directly, then what makes me afraid is that we'll miss the chance to actually leverage these to become better. And the first one is the idea that during highly volatile environments, organizations and their leaders, but really organizations are the people that work there, had to make early decisions based upon much smaller data sets and understanding that agility is actually a capacity for managing uncertainty. Now, we've been saying this a long time, but all of a sudden we have boardroom examples of people not making long term strategic 15-year decisions or even short term strategic 5-year decisions. They're honest to God making decisions for tomorrow, or even in John's example earlier today, kind of this afternoon. And one of the things that I think is illustrated beautifully by this horrific pandemic is how significant agility is at the leadership level. That it's okay to flex and turn and adapt to a changing, complex world that's around you. And what I think is important about that, and this is really my challenge to you, is that I think traditionally organizations did not value agility at the CEO, board, C suite level. In fact, what they valued was stable, work to plan, very, very dependable decisions based upon tremendous amount of data, removing risk and replacing it with information. The notion of predicting the future in order to control the future. The second thing that came out of the VUCA data, which I actually think is the most interesting of the four things I'm going to speak of, is this idea that actually during highly complex times, during great levels of uncertainty, organizations should become more diverse, not less diverse. And diversity can mean a lot of things. It's everything that we know diversity to mean, but it's also the fact that you really want to not circle the wagons and move internally in your complex decision making, but in fact, we know in a VUCA environment that's exactly wrong. What you want to do when you're in a highly volatile environment is actually do exactly the opposite, to reach out and realize that expertise lives at every level of your organization, and that the more people you engage in strategically discussing decisions that need to be made immediately, the better those strategic discussions become. Again, this is what we've talked about for years, that workers understand work much better than leaders understand work. John just talked about that very idea. And that what's interesting is that decisions that were once made behind closed doors, smoke filled rooms with leather chairs and really good coffee, maybe not the best decisions we can make. And then there's the idea of the third issue that you see when managing a VUCA environment. And that's the idea of temporarily trading short term certainty for long term stability. Now, this sounds almost blasphemous, small b, not large. But the research seems to say that actually you can look at small micro experiments, a word you've heard a lot, and actually create short term certainty in lieu of the long term 15-year strategic plan. And what this helps us remember, and this is something we've talked about forever, is that when you have uncertain outcomes, you manage those uncertain outcomes with certain activities. You manage uncertain risk with certain controls. And then finally, the last one, and maybe the most important one, the one that I find most interesting, and I'd be curious if you do as well, is that we have to monitor the organization's ability to learn. Now, this idea of building feedback, we can talk about it a lot, I think is foundationally really important for us to talk about, but that's not the part of the VUCA theory that I find the most sexy. The part I find the most sexy is that they use the word monitor, not the word measure. And here's what we know, and we know it for sure, and that is that the metrics we've traditionally used, the metrics that we thought were meaningful 16 months ago, really appeared very meaningless during the midst of the global pandemic. And that in fact, metrics allow us the ability to look backwards, but they don't really give us the ability to move forward. So, what do we learn? Because that's the key. In fact, that sort of sets up Deidre for what she's going to talk about next. And I actually think what we learned is quite interesting because if we look at what this crisis teaches us, there's some things that we can really draw on and use as foundations to improve the discussions we have, the baby food, if you will, of how we move forward with our organizations. Because I think in many ways, our job is to help bridge this uncertainty with the information that we've been gathering for a long time within the organization. And the first thing I think we could learn, what this has taught us, is that our systems are pretty brittle. And you may ask this question, well, why don't systems break all the time? And the answer is the reason systems don't break all the time is because adaptive workers create really these outcomes that aren't the negative consequences. And that very adaptive workers are constantly working in complex systems to create meaningful work. And what's amazing to me, and this was a big part of the discussions I had with all these people, is that the leaders were pretty surprised by that idea. In fact, I had a leader of a giant company tell me what amazed him most of all was that when they took all the administrative people out of the system and only the essential workers were actually running the warehouses, that their event numbers went down. So they had fewer injuries and their productivity went up. And he then said to me, I was amazed at how adaptive the workforce was. And I think the important thing we would say to that is they were always that adaptive. That what changed is not the adaptive nature of the workers doing the work. What changed is the way the leadership looked forward. And this idea becomes a really powerful idea. It's really challenged me because what I hear leaders tell me all the time is that, in fact, their workers make bad choices. But what I find is that it's hardly ever their workers making bad choices. It's almost always their workers having bad choices. And that difference is relatively profound. The second thing I think this crisis has taught us is that anticipation has not been recognized as a helpful piece of information. It's not been seen as legitimate. And yet, one of the things we know is that the ability for workers to anticipate what is next is inherently an incredibly powerful part of what allows them to become successful. Their ability to identify weak signals, kind of in a Carlene Roberts way, and then detect those signals and correct in real time really helps us understand this notion of managing uncertainty. The third one, which actually Sydney just talked about a little bit with Fred, which I found really interesting, is ultimately our organizations are not terribly good at learning. In fact, I would suggest we suck at learning. And I would challenge you that one of the biggest problems is that the organization believes they already know. the strategic plan tells us this is what's going to happen. And because we already know, there's really not a lot of appetite to actually learn. And what's remarkable about that is that I think the one thing that the pandemic has done is it's dramatically changed the access that leaders have to the workforce. Say what you will, and we could talk about this a long time, but in many ways, organizationally, Zoom has been kind of the great equalizer. It's allowed people access and a voice that they may not have traditionally had, or it's allowed them to have a voice that was oftentimes vetoed or overshadowed by other voices that were closer to the locus of power. The fourth thing I think we learned, which is really valuable, and that's important to us, is the value of reciprocity, the value of building relationships, the value of engaging workers, the value of actually building industry networks, sort of the Thomas Kuhn idea of an invisible college. And that when in fact we had to respond in the midst of this uncertainty, one of the places that we found most helpful was the ability to sort of lean on each other. And then the final thing is that learning and adapting are fundamental to building capacity. And that ultimately organizations become better with their ability to learn. And so out of this, I collected what leaders told me. And here's what I came up with. We have to deliberately build systems that have tolerance, that have resilience, that are, in Linda's words, anti fragile. We have to insist upon a diversity of information because talking only to fewer people about larger problems is the wrong way to move forward. We should talk to more people. And by talking to more people, what we gather is more perceptions and more ideas and understanding. But what we really gather is a much better way to frame the analysis. We have to build relationships as a strategy and be generous in the way we build those relationships. Because when we need each other in the midst of uncertainty, that's actually an incredibly deep, incredibly important well that we can draw upon. And finally, I think most importantly, we have to purposely monitor the capacity to learn. So if you ask me, you didn't, but if you did, I will tell you that the opportunity to come out of a global pandemic better, less cluttered, more sensitive to greater diversity within the organization, and more prone to learn is just there for the asking. But I think there's two questions that I'd challenge you. And if you haven't asked these yet in your organization, ask them. The first one is bring some workers together and ask them this. When we went to the essential worker and the administrative burdens that we placed upon you went away, and we went from 400,000 rules to 3 rules, what'd you miss? And their answer, I think, is going to be relatively important for you to listen because they're going to talk about the things that they need the organization to pick up and carry. And then the second question is, what didn't you miss? Because I think that gives us the opportunity to declutter and improve our organizations from a platform that everybody understands, a platform that is moving towards optimizing efficiency, towards optimizing this idea of capacity. That, I think, is the story of the pandemic. And that's the challenge I want to give everybody is coming out of this stronger and better, I think is not only a nice idea, but quite honestly, pretty doable. It's just a matter of making the environment in which we work sensitized to the fact that a lot of change happened and we moved them on that innovation curve. They're no longer those incredible innovators early adopters, we're now sort of in the midst of the bell curve. That's what I've got for you guys today. I hope that helped. It was sure fun talking to you.
Todd, don't go away yet because we want a lot more. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you from everyone. That was reflective, considerate, deep, and incredibly encouraging. It is, of course, a well known fact in history and historiography that the power of pandemics is to create historical inflection points. Women's emancipation, in fact, worker emancipation after the Black Death in Europe, for example, in the Middle Ages, because simple power of numbers, not enough workers to do all the work, so their bargaining power shot up dramatically, right? And so, not all countries capitalized on this based on feudal structures and other things, but that we would be facing a moment of inflection, historical inflection, and therefore enormous opportunity was always dawning on me. But to hear and see it unpacked and being applied to the scholarship that you also have, of course, been part of developing and promoting over the past 2 decades, is really empowering. That was a long sentence. What I mean in with all my heart is I am both humbled and encouraged by the idea that a pandemic presents this opportunity to us. In a sense, what I would love to do, perhaps not now, but in a further panel discussion, and perhaps even throughout the remainder of the day, is to make sure that we have told each other everything that we need to say to each other to not miss this opportunity. You raised those two questions. Those are relatively, if I may use the word, pedestrian decluttering questions and incredibly lowball. Very important. I'm with you. That's not the issue. But it's particularly the answers that will give us some connections into what we shouldn't be missing in order to capitalize on this opportunity. I have seen some questions come by, Todd, but we won't have to deal with them yet because I think we need to do that once we're in the panel. But where there are already suggestions that how long will this humility last? This openness to understanding that we are at an inflection point. When will the cynicism of capitalism come roaring back in with short-term economies and 3-monthly reporting cycles that get us right back into safety one without a blink? What is it that we should be doing and shouldn't be missing in order to prevent that from happening? How can we sustain that humility and inquisitiveness and the realization that the world is moving faster than our ability to predict can ever be? There's some minutes to reflect on those before I have to give it back to Dave. But if you want to, go ahead, my friend. You and I could be having this conversation over a couple beers for the rest of your evening.
Let's do it. I'm there for you. So I think it's going to be short lived. I think we must act as timely as we possibly can, and I think that it'll be superseded by events because I think there's going to be a great amount of denial, this belief that we sort of made it through this, and the need to go back. I think John called it the Great COVID Reset. This idea of going back somehow is attractive because it again reduces the belief in uncertainty, and I think the idea that this is a phenomenon that won't happen again for 100 years makes it attractive to actually go back to the very same administrative burdens and just bureaucratic crap that we've put on workers. I think the advantage we have is that we now have a frame of reference that's larger than us. It's larger than the field guide. It's larger than safety. It's actually larger. It's globally impactful because they can really recall the period of time when they weren't ready for an uncertain event that they did not predict. And I think our job, to a great extent, is to leverage that as carefully as we can and as effectively as we can within our organizations while the iron is hot. And it's probably less hot now than it was even a month ago.
Mm,
But I
yep.
I do think the opportunity to change the conversation at really the organizational leadership level has brought itself to the forefront. And it's interesting to me with that Fueler story, that supervisor that was pretty much going to punish those guys, that when we took it to the larger sort of uncertainty question, he was really prepared to go there. And to me, I think the thing that I think about most, Sydney, is how Ev's work around the diffusion is really poignant, and how once our ideas were novel and aggressive and edgy, uh, I'm not sure our ideas have changed dramatically. I think the organization's much more prone to receive information that they probably did not think they could receive even a year ago, year and a half ago. And the one I'm drawn to, just because I find it so incredibly compelling, because it's really to a great extent your life's work, is the notion that if we build more diversity in our strategic decision making, we make better strategic decisions, which I think is directly counter to what captains of industry have thought in the past. And I think that's very appealing.
And how ironic that it's two white guys in their middle age talking about that, Todd. Hey.
I know, I know. Look how good we are, huh?
With that, I will hand it back, unfortunately, to Dave, although I wanted to hand it back to Kim. But in the name of diversity, back to both of you.